Look, obviously some of the restrictions, including the curfew, are easing on Sunday night. But, I think there needs to be an examination of, all of the measures that have been put in place in order to deal with the pandemic. I think that's part of, being in a society like ours where there is openness and transparency. Obviously in Victoria we have the Coates inquiry, which is on foot at the moment, into hotel quarantine. And the Premier has said, the buck stops with him. He is the one who is ultimately responsible. So I think, there will be an examination. But what I think people do expect is that of course, everyone in Melbourne is tired of the lockdown. I mean, you see people, checking their watches to make sure they haven't been out for more than 60 minutes. Because that's the current restriction at the moment. But I think people want this to work. I mean, we've just heard this morning that the Christmas windows in Myer in Burke Street won't be happening this year, partly because of the restrictions around the pandemic. And I think people want as much normalcy as quickly as they can. And if these restrictions work, then hopefully we are going to get back there more quickly. But just on curfew, I mean, this is totemic, and it's going to have a bigger impact from Sunday when you'll have, for example, this ability to visit someone in your so-called bubble. That would still be affected by curfew. So does this really need to be examined? And I mean, do you fundamentally agree with the curfew that ministers have come up with that wasn't advised by the Chief Health Officer nor police?
Well, I think, look, I think, Tom, that these restrictions will be examined, and of course, there are restrictions all over the country, certainly as we've been seeing, in the last couple of days in Queensland. The federal government has put restrictions on exit visas. I mean, when I think of, needing an exit visa to leave the country, I think of East Germany in the 1950s. But these are harsh measures that every level of government has implemented in order to try to have the best health response that is available. And I can assure you that having, Victorians, and of course there are some suburbs in Victoria that have been under strict lockdown for longer than others because they were hot spots and they were, identified earlier. Of course people want this over, but they also don't want to go back into another lockdown later on in the year. I mean, I'm hoping that I personally am... Yeah.
No,
I was just going to say I am personally hoping that this happens because, I have family in Queensland. I would like to see them at Christmas. I think that we're all motivated to try to get through this and
what about Queensland then? I want to ask you about that. Are you going to defend this decision from authorities, seemingly from the Chief Health Officer on a woman from Canberra, COVID-free Canberra, has been for more than 60 days, wanted to visit her ill father, forced to stay in hotel quarantine. He died, then denied permission to go to the funeral. Would you support that? Is that commensurate to the risk,
I think
that decision?
Of course, do you know why these cases upset us so much? Because we are actually compassionate. And you think, back pre-COVID, we know stories of airlines. If someone's, they phone an airline to book a flight very quickly and they say that they have a dying relative, airlines would get those people onto the first flight. And that is because we are compassionate people. So we do care when we hear these stories. But I think we do want compassion, and I think we want consistency in the application of these rules. So, Queensland's let in, AFL players, etc. But I think that we also want, we do want the consistency. I think that's what, makes people upset. And I think we also want some common sense around these measures. And I think it's a good step that the Queensland government has taken, which is to set up a unit to deal with these cases that need to be treated.
Can we even believe the health advice?
In order for Ms. Case... Well, I think it took 20 days for Ms. Casey to get an exemption. Obviously, that's a long time when you have, your father is dying.
It's too long,
but
surely.
I do think that...
let me just ask you this. Can we even trust the health advice when we're getting told by Dr Jeanette Young, the Chief Health Officer, that the reason this person was at risk, even though she was from the ACT, was an outbreak at Bateman's Bay, and, quote, people from Canberra travelled to Bateman's Bay. That outbreak was in July. It was limited, never spread to Canberra and doesn't exist anymore. How can that be health advice?
Well, I think that's why they've set up a unit to deal with these cases. So but I would say to you, Tom, that when we see the Prime Minister on Ray Hadley's program discussing this, what brought to mind is that there are lots of these cases. There are a lot of people who are trying, for example, to get into South Australia. And in fact, if you have a quick look through social media, you will see, people being refused permits to go into South Australia. There are lots of these cases, and we haven't heard anything about those cases from the Prime Minister. And I have to say, I think that there's a reason that the South Australian Premier is a Liberal Premier, and obviously Anastasia Palaszczuk is a Labor Premier, and she is also there is an election coming up in Queensland. So there has to be, that's why I'm saying to you, I think there needs to be consistency around the application in these matters.